Something significant just surfaced in California, and it's raising questions that go well beyond one warehouse closure. An Amazon facility shutdown has reportedly put Governor Gavin Newsom in an uncomfortable position, not because of the closure itself, but because of what it appears to reveal about decisions made behind closed doors. This isn't about labor disputes or routine operational changes. What's emerging suggests a deeper friction between the state's regulatory environment and one of the largest employers in the country. And if the details that are starting to circulate hold up, this could reshape how we understand the balance of power between state governments and major corporations in the current economic climate. For Californians, the immediate concern is jobs and regional economic stability. But for the rest of the country, this may be an early indicator of how aggressive state-level policies interact with corporate strategy during a period of economic uncertainty. The implications stretch into tax revenue, employment trends, and whether other states might face similar confrontations. This story is still unfolding, but the stakes are already clear. Let me start by walking you through what we know so far, because the details matter here, and they paint a picture that's more complex than the headlines suggest. Amazon announced the closure of a major warehouse facility in California earlier this month, and at first, it seemed like just another corporate restructuring decision. Companies open and close facilities all the time based on logistics, cost efficiency, and market demand. But then documents started emerging that showed state officials had been in direct communication with Amazon executives for months before the announcement. And those communications revealed something that a lot of people didn't expect. There had been pressure from Sacramento not to keep the facility open, but regarding compliance with a new set of labor and environmental regulations that were about to take effect. Now, Governor Newsom's office has maintained that California's regulations are designed to protect workers and the environment, and that any company operating in the state needs to meet those standards. That's a perfectly reasonable position on the surface. But what's becoming clear is that Amazon apparently raised concerns early on about the feasibility of meeting these new requirements at this particular facility without massive capital investment. And those concerns were either dismissed or not taken seriously enough to prompt any kind of negotiation or transition period. So when the shutdown was announced, it caught local officials and workers off guard, even though the state government had been in the loop for quite some time. The political fallout started almost immediately. Republican lawmakers in California, along with some moderate Democrats representing districts where Amazon employs significant numbers of people, began asking why there hadn't been more transparency about these discussions. They wanted to know if the administration had done a proper economic impact assessment before pushing forward with regulations that could force major employers to make these kinds of decisions. And that's where things get uncomfortable for the governor, because it turns out that the economic impact study that was conducted was fairly limited in scope and didn't fully account for the possibility of large-scale closures in the logistics and warehousing sector. What makes this particularly sensitive right now is the broader economic context. California has been dealing with a budget deficit that's larger than most people anticipated. The state's tax revenues have been declining as high earners and businesses relocate to states with lower tax burdens. The tech sector, which has been a massive driver of California's economy for decades, has been contracting and laying off workers. Commercial real estate in San Francisco and other major cities is struggling as remote work becomes permanent for many companies. So the last thing California needs right now is a high-profile employer pulling out and taking hundreds of jobs with them, especially in regions that are already economically vulnerable. The Amazon warehouse in question employed around 400 people directly and supported probably another 100 or so indirect jobs through contractors and local suppliers. That might not sound like a huge number in a state with nearly 40 million people, but in the specific community where this facility was located, it represented a significant portion of the local employment base. These are often areas that don't have a lot of alternative employment options. When a major employer leaves, it creates a ripple effect. Local businesses that relied on workers from that facility start seeing reduced foot traffic. Property values can decline, tax revenues for the city and county drop, and workers who lose their jobs often have to choose between relocating to find similar work or accepting lower-paying positions in different industries. Now, here's where the governor's position becomes more complicated. Newsom has built much of his political brand on being pro-worker and pro-environment, and those are genuinely popular positions in California, especially in the urban centers that dominate state politics. The regulations that apparently contributed to this closure were designed with good intentions. They aimed to improve working conditions in warehouses, reduce carbon emissions from logistics operations, and ensure that companies weren't cutting corners on safety. Those are all legitimate goals, but the execution seems to have overlooked the economic reality that companies will make cost-benefit analyses, and if compliance becomes too expensive in one location, they'll simply move operations elsewhere. And that's exactly what Amazon appears to have done. They didn't shut down the operation entirely. They shifted it to a facility in Nevada, which has far less stringent regulations and significantly lower operating costs. So, from Amazon's perspective, they're still serving the same market, still employing people, just not in California. But from California's perspective, the state just lost jobs, lost tax revenue, and didn't actually achieve the environmental or labor goals they were aiming for because the work is still happening. It's just happening somewhere else now. This is the dilemma that a lot of progressive states are facing right now. They want to set high standards for corporate behavior, and in theory, that's admirable. But in practice, especially in industries where companies have flexibility about where to locate operations, aggressive regulation can backfire. It doesn't force companies to comply with better standards. It just pushes them across state lines to jurisdictions that are more willing to compete for their business. And in a federal system like the United States, where states have significant autonomy to set their own policies, this creates a kind of regulatory competition that often works against the interests of states trying to maintain high standards. What's making this situation even more politically charged is that it's happening in an election year. Newsom isn't up for re-election as governor, but he's widely seen as having national political ambitions, and how he handles economic issues in California will absolutely affect his viability as a national figure. If the narrative becomes that his policies are driving jobs out of the state, that's a serious political liability, not just in California, but nationally. Republicans are already using this incident as evidence that progressive economic policies don't work in practice, and some Democrats are quietly expressing concerns that the party needs to be more careful about balancing progressive values with economic pragmatism. The documents that have come to light show that Amazon sent multiple letters to state officials outlining the specific challenges they were facing with the new regulations. They requested extensions, they proposed alternative compliance pathways, they offered to invest in partial upgrades if the state would phase in certain requirements over a longer timeline. But according to people familiar with the negotiations, the state's position was essentially that the regulations were non-negotiable and that Amazon needed to find a way to comply or face penalties. Amazon chose a third option. They left. Now, you might argue that this is just how regulation works. The state sets the rules, and companies either follow them or face consequences. And in a perfect world where companies didn't have the option to relocate, that might be fine. But we don't live in that world. We live in a world where capital is mobile, where companies can and will move operations to wherever the business environment is most favorable. And state governments have to account for that reality when they're designing policy. It's not enough to pass regulations that look good on paper. You have to think through the second-order effects, the unintended consequences, the ways that rational actors will respond to the incentives you're creating. There's also a deeper question here about what kind of economy California wants to have going forward. For a long time, the state could get away with high taxes and strict regulations because it offered things that other states couldn't: access to capital, a highly educated workforce, proximity to major markets, cultural amenities, good weather. But some of those advantages are eroding. Remote work means that companies and workers don't need to be physically located in expensive coastal cities anymore. Other states have invested heavily in education and infrastructure and are offering competitive alternatives. And the cost of living in California has become so high that it's actually a recruitment barrier for many companies trying to attract talent. The warehouse closure is symbolic of a larger trend. California is losing its grip on industries that used to be reliably anchored in the state. Manufacturing left decades ago. Now logistics and distribution are starting to shift. Even tech companies, which have been the backbone of California's economy, are opening major offices in Austin, Miami, Nashville, and other cities that offer lower costs and more business-friendly environments. Each individual company departure might seem small, but cumulatively, they represent a significant erosion of the state's economic base. And here's the thing that should worry California policymakers the most. Once this process starts, it tends to accelerate. When the first few companies leave, it creates a template for others to follow. It demonstrates that relocation is feasible, that other states are willing to accommodate them, that the transition can be managed without catastrophic disruption. And as more companies leave, the value proposition of staying in California weakens further. Tax revenues decline, which means the state has to either cut services or raise taxes on those who remain, which creates additional incentive for more people and businesses to leave. It's a vicious cycle, and it's very difficult to reverse once it gains momentum. Governor Newsom and his team are clearly aware of this dynamic, which is probably why they've been relatively quiet about the Amazon situation. They don't want to draw more attention to it than necessary. They don't want to validate the narrative that California is becoming inhospitable to business. But the silence is also creating problems because it allows critics to fill the vacuum with their own interpretations, and it leaves workers and local officials feeling like they've been left in the dark about decisions that profoundly affect their lives. What would a better approach have looked like? Probably something that involved earlier and more substantive engagement with Amazon and other major employers in the logistics sector. If the state knew that new regulations were going to impose significant costs, they should have worked with industry to understand what compliance would realistically require, what timeline would be feasible, and whether there were ways to achieve the same policy goals through alternative means. Maybe that would have meant phasing in requirements more gradually. Maybe it would have meant offering tax credits or other incentives to offset compliance costs. Maybe it would have meant accepting that certain standards would need to be adjusted based on economic feasibility. The point is that effective governance requires balancing multiple priorities: environmental protection, worker welfare, economic stability, tax revenue, social cohesion. When you pursue one goal so aggressively that you neglect the others, you end up with outcomes like this, where nobody really wins. The workers lost their jobs. The state lost tax revenue. The environment didn't improve because the operations just moved elsewhere. And the governor is now facing political backlash that could have been avoided with more thoughtful policy design. Looking ahead, the real test is whether California learns from this experience or doubles down on the approach that created the problem. There are already signals going in both directions. Some legislators are calling for reviews of how regulations are assessed for economic impact before implementation. Others are insisting that the state shouldn't compromise on its values just because corporations threaten to leave. Both perspectives have merit, but finding the right balance is going to be critical for California's future. The Amazon warehouse closure might seem like a small story in the grand scheme of things, but it represents something much larger. A fundamental tension between the kind of state California aspires to be and the economic realities it has to navigate. How that tension gets resolved will determine not just the fate of one governor's political career, but the trajectory of the nation's most populous state and the viability of progressive economic policy more broadly. And that's why this story matters far beyond California's borders.